Heroes! It is I, Tantus Narva Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons 5th Ed D&D. Where we last left off, we were talking about the event-based encounters and some specialized types of them. Let's finish up with that today first, with the Intrigue adventure. Now the thing is, not all adventures are driving out into the wild. You could easily have some kind of adventure that has to deal with the court, the exchange of powers of nobles. Basically, an intrigue adventure revolves around power struggles. Again, it's usually within a court of nobles, but there are other circumstances where these power struggles could exist within other organizations where they could make perfect sense. These adventures revolve around the exchange of favors between groups, the rise and falls of personal power of various individuals, and of course, diplomacy. The thing about this, though, is your players have to be involved in the situation. They have to be interested in whatever kind of intrigue is going on. They have to be embroiled in the results of it. Perhaps offering some kind of favor can draw them into it in the first place, that they're exchanging favors with this one noble, and it draws them into the overall intrigue of it. Because if the characters don't care about what's going on, they're not going to actually care about what's going on and actually act within the intrigue. It's not a sword and board kind of adventure, it's a diplomacy kind of adventure. So of course, maybe a powerful NPC will get them into it. Now if you do manage to get your characters into an intrigue adventure, there are two major differences. Influence within the court, and villains. Let's talk about villains first. So of course, just like any other event-based encounter, you can have just a normal villain like you would have set up before. You'd roll it out just fine, except it's more a direct kind of moo-hoo-ha villain. It's basically a power struggle kind of villain. Maybe they're trying to seize power or something rather. But the Intrigue adventure offers you some other opportunities. No villain, or multiple villains. So if you choose to have no villains, it's all about the exchange of favors for the adventure. That perhaps a lord is asking you to help out as part of this intrigue and exchanging a favor. There is no villain to oppose. You're not going to do those first two steps of the event-based adventures that I talked about. You're going to sort of focus on their goal, the goal of those players, because there isn't a villain they're opposing. There's just this goal that they're going to have to do within this entire adventure. You're going to focus a lot on these NPCs they're going to encounter, making them very alive and interesting things to encounter, of course, the part of this adventure. On the other hand, you can have multiple villains. You do step 1 and 2 for all of these villains. You're going to make each villain an individual, have their own goals and aspirations in different things. A good example of this is maybe something happens to the king, and there's a court of nobles that all see an opportunity to grab some power. So now, your players may represent the king or his family, and might try to keep these nobles at bay, but just don't want to kill them. The intrigue comes in. But you can see that all of them are now established as these villains going against you, even though they're not really terrible villainous characters per se, they're villains of the story. So you're going to focus on 1 and 2 to establish them a lot, and you're going to come up with all these individual characters. When it comes to step 5, your players opposing the villains. This is also something you're going to play a little differently. As your players are going to oppose their goals, you're not going to put it forward as much planning out the alterations. Each of these villains will continue to push their goals forward, and assume that as much as they're being foiled, you're not going to dive into their reactions as much. They're basically going to push forward much, because you're not focusing on the individual villain and going against the players. You're focusing them more on as a group, as they're dealing with all of them separately. So you don't want to push that focus as much forward. Basically, you're going to assume a lot more about these villains, that they're going to just sort of continue their plans as necessary until they're technically foiled. You know, it's going to be, they're going to foil each of these steps. It's just going to keep going still, until they reach the end step, and then they've managed to foil them. Hurrah! You don't have a lot more of that reactionariness. That's a good way of describing it. You don't have those reactions quite the same. Now, influence is the other side, because you might want to track your players' influence with NPCs or factions within this setting. It is important to note that you'd want to treat each of your players' influence separately in this case. Now, there are two sort of ways that you can go about keep using this influence. The first off, you can use influence like inspiration. What this means is, as I've done actions to earn my influence with this NPC or with this organization, I effectively get this influence I can use to gain advantage in a check related to them. Maybe because I influence them so much, I can then get advantage on a check I would need to convince them to help me out in the future. Basically, it's like I can use advantage on a diplomacy to basically say, hey, help me out in this other side here, which they normally wouldn't have gotten involved with. I can see that the influence that I've earned has given me a bonus in this circumstance. The other way is to track it like renown, which you talked about earlier, and just use that to keep track of the influence the character has within the court or the individual. Now, let's move on, though, a little bit. Let's talk about a framing event, because the fact is, you're probably going to want some kind of framing event to bring all your characters into the adventure. Base it around there. A framing event is basically that initial event that's going to basically drive everything home. The big event that's going to frame the story. This might not be the first event that happens with your characters, but what it be is it's going to be an event that's going to basically put forward how the adventure is going to run out as a whole. Now, there's a list of framing events that they suggest within the book. Of course, could roll one randomly and take it, or you could use them to basically come up with inspiration on your own, to either make your own or adapt one of these. Let's talk about complications, because guess what? In the course of the adventure, your players are going to encounter complications. These are things that are going to make the adventures that you're running a little more interesting for your players. Little things that are going to change up the normal formula for them. So this is not complications for you, it's complications for them. So the first type of complication I want to talk about is something that is not solved with sword or sorcery. The moral quandary. So the moral quandary. Well, the moral quandary itself divides up into separate ones, to different types of moral quandaries. These are problems of conscience, which over the course of the adventure require the characters to make some form of decision. That's what it's basically going to boil down to. And it's not an easy decision. That's the point of it. It's not supposed to be an easy one. So today I'm only going to talk about one of them. We'll finish up next time the rest of them. The ally quandary. So the setup is this, it's simple. In the course of your adventure, you've come across two NPCs, which are critical to the completion of the adventure. Whatever that adventure it is, both of these NPCs offer critical skills to the completion of it. The caveat: they hate each other. They hate each other so much that even if it means the world will be destroyed, they will not work together. You have to choose between these two NPCs. Which one is going to help you save the world? Or complete your adventure is really what I should say. Because, again, it doesn't necessarily mean you're saving the world. Which one will you choose? That's it for today. I first talked about the last type of event-based adventure I want to discuss. The Intrigue adventure, where you might have a single villain, no villains, or multiple villains. An adventure where it's all about the struggle for power, especially with things like courts of nobles, where you might have an influence score, which you will use to see how you're tracking with players. Then, of course, I moved into the framing event, an important event as a part of your adventure, before moving into complications and starting with the moral quandary, a question of conscience. We've only gone over one today, but in the next episode, we will finish up with the rest of the moral quandaries, talking about them, moving into twists and side quests, other complications to your adventure, before moving into talking about building your own encounters. But regardless, if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon. Link description below. But until the next time, I bid you farewell.